It won't hide you.
We're already off to a bad start.
Hiding behind the door prize.
Okay, we're going to move this because we all want to see David, but we're at the end, we're going to ask for you guys to complete a survey. And as a reward for that, we have yummy, great door prizes. And I'll get to that in a second, and I'll move this so we can see you. But I just wanted everybody to be impressed with great prize. All right. We also have some newly minted IFOB caps. We have a Husson Lovely t-shirt, and we have a $25, oops, I'm throwing it around, because it's coffee and it's caffeine. It's a Starbucks card, so from Perkins Thompson. So thank you all for coming. Welcome to our remote users. Do we have them in, Russell? Thank you. And we'll be recording this program, and we may post it on YouTube as a webinar at a later date. So the IFOB is a nonprofit that helps family businesses succeed. We were started over 20 years ago by Chef Lee from the Outer Malls. We have over 40 programs this year, and all members and future members. So I know we have members and future members here, and you're all welcome. So please take a look out front. I do have a calendar of events that are coming up. It's also on our website. Our memberships run from the calendar year, so they start in January and go through to December. So it's a really good time to join because everything's half off now. And it includes all your employees and family members, so it's kind of like, I make it like burritos, munch all you want. You can come to one of our programs. And if you can't come in person, you can always remote in. So we'd love to have you join us. Our board has instituted a code of conduct, and they ask that I read it every time we have a program. So the Insitute for Family-Owned Business, IFOB, is a nonprofit organization dedicated to the success of family-owned businesses in the state of Maine. Our purpose is to provide opportunities for family-owned businesses to gain knowledge and expertise concerning the challenges specific to family businesses. Shared expertise comes from IFOB resources, invited experts, sponsors, associate partners, and family business members themselves. Through the IFOB, relationships will develop that are valuable to all concerned. To foster an environment necessary for trust and sharing, proceedings of the IFOB should not be used for professional advantage. We expect confidentiality in all matters discussed and shared in our programs. Solicitation of business at events, programs is inconsistent with the overall mission of the IFOB. Thank you for respecting this code of conduct. So today, we have our first in a three-part series of the art of family business. So I did, there's action, reaction, and traction. So we're gonna have David come up and speak about that in a few minutes. I'd like to, and we also have postcards out front for the continuing programs. And we do have a flyer for the next one that is on taxes. I'd like to thank our sponsors, Albin, Randall, and Bennett, Perkins Thompson, Clark Insurance, Husson University, and Maine Gifts. In a few minutes, I'd like to invite David Jean from Albin, Randall, and Bennett, and Tim Benoit from Perkins Thompson to say a few words, and then we'll turn it over to Tony Payne, our moderator from Clark Insurance. So David Jean is from Altus Exit Strategies, and he'll introduce our series and this program, and Tim is from Perkins Thompson. And as I mentioned, we do value your feedback, so at the end, I will be handing out these surveys. This is how we build our programs through the year. Last year, we had a lot of people asking about succession, so we did a series on succession planning, and then from those surveys, they said, okay, 96% of people know that they want a business plan, but only 13% have one that's actually a succession plan that's actually working. So they said, okay, help us kickstart this. So that's why we're here today. And so again, we value your feedback, and that's how we build our programs, and we'll do door prizes. And now I'll turn it over to David. Thank you.
Good morning, all. Thank you all for attending this bright sunny morning. Just wanted to go over the three-part series. Today is the first part of the family succession series. So please do mark your calendar for the upcoming events. On Wednesday, August the 23rd, we're going to be having a topic on best practices to manage taxes now and in the future panel. And we're going to have some folks from Baker Newman Noyes as well as Barry Nunn to talk on that particular day. And again, Wednesday, August 23rd, and that's going to be located at this facility. And the third part series will be on Wednesday, October the 25th, and it's going to be on free. We all like free stuff. This is free federal and state resources for family-owned businesses at IFOB Associate Partner Member Services Showcase. That will be held actually at Ocean View in Falmouth, so please make note of that. And we're going to be having presenters Amy Bassett from the USBA, Brian Whitney, president of Maine Technology Institute, Nancy Strani, the chapter chair from Portland SCORE, and Commissioner Gervais for the Department of Economic and Community Development. A lot of time and effort has been focused on this three-part series, and we hope you can all attend. Thank you.
Thank you, David. Good morning, all. As a sponsor of this, the IFOB gives us an opportunity to just say a few words, but I want to take this opportunity to really encourage any of you out there who are not yet members to become members of the IFOB. It is a tremendous organization with numerous resources, presentations like this, the Family Business Awards in the spring is a major event. I just can't say enough about the Insitute. It is a tremendous opportunity and full of resources. So I encourage you to join if you haven't already. Thanks.
I wondered if that was.
Can everybody hear me okay? Yeah. Okay, I'll go without the mic. Good morning, I'm Tony Payne, and I understand this clicker works, so we'll try that. Or that, or we won't do any of it. Let me get my remarks out here. Let me start off by introducing the panel. I'm Tony Payne. I'm the Vice President of Business Development at Clark Insurance. We're just down the road here, and we have a seat on the Board of Directors of the IFOB. Joining us on the panel this morning, and a lot of you saw the lineup, so I'm going to do an abbreviated version. David Jean, who you just heard from, has provided financial accounting, tax, and consulting services for closely held businesses for 25 years. He is an expert in identifying exit and succession planning objectives, upholding business continuity, and planning for personal wealth and estate. David is a member of the Institute for Family-Owned Business and Business Enterprise Institute. Tim Benoit, who you also just heard from, is a shareholder and director of Perkins Thompson, a Portland-based law firm. He provides legal counsel to individuals and entities and has been involved in many merger, acquisition, and acquisition transitions. In addition, Tim provides estate planning to individuals and integrates his business practice with his estate planning practice to assist clients develop an orderly succession plan for their businesses, which is the business of the morning. Jim Lyon is the founder of Summit 9 Consulting. Jim is a seasoned executive in startup, with startup and Fortune, all the way through Fortune 500 companies, and helps clients in marketing, sales, finance, IT management, and strategic planning. Jim has an MBA from the University of Chicago and a BA in economics from Grinnell College. And finally, Jeannine Pendergast is vice president and senior ESOP client advisor for Spinnaker Trust. She's a native of Rochester, New York, and began her career in public accounting for companies in all industries, including employee benefit plans. She's been an internal trustee for a large ESOP plan, actively managing the plan, including the internal record keeping, repurchase obligation studies, annual stock valuation analysis, education, and advising on a day-to-day operational basis. Jeannine joined Spinnaker Trust in 2015, and she is a trusted resource for their ESOP clients. Well, Catherine gave you the good news and the bad news. The good news is that most family-owned businesses recognize the need for a perpetuation plan. Only 13% have actually undertaken that task. Thank you for being here. You are going to up the percentage substantially this morning. Here's some other gee whiz facts, though, that may be of interest. About 60% of owners in a national poll thought that they'd probably sell to third parties. About 30% intend to transfer the business to their children or a child. And about 31% said they plan to sell their management to either sell their company either to management or their employees. So you're, roughly speaking, in that 1/3 that expect to move this business into the hands of your children. No matter what your current role may be, I got a question for you. How many of you expect to be owning and running your business when you turn 100? All right, so as I said to David this morning, is that in some ways this morning we're confronting our mortality. Really happy thought. But the reality is that we're also here to plan how do you get out of the business, leave a legacy, and be sure that your nest egg is well cared for. So we're going to start right off. I've got a bunch of questions. We're going to have each panelist field these questions, but the others can chime in. If you have questions as we go along, don't hesitate. I think that's, I'd like this to be a conversation for all of us to make sure that your answers your questions are covered. So for David, they say that if you don't know where you're going, any road will take you there. Briefly, what are the primary objectives family-owned businesses should consider when planning succession and perpetuation of the organization?
Thank you, Tony. When I think of succession planning, I often think of that famous Chinese proverb, a journey of 1,000 miles begins with a single step. And I think to some extent, succession planning really is analogous to that. What is the first step? How can you get beyond the inertia and sort of kickstart your succession plan? And I always start with business owners and ask themselves 3 important questions. And without addressing those 3 important questions, there is nowhere to go. And the first question owners need to ask themselves is the who. Who am I going to be transferring my business to? Perhaps it's a third party. In some family businesses, sometimes third-party sales do make sense. Perhaps you have children who aren't passionate about the business. Perhaps there's financial reasons, or perhaps there's a strategic buyer that's willing to pay you an insurmountable amount of money for your business. Perhaps it's an ESOP, or perhaps it's a partial ESOP. Perhaps it's a family member, family members, or perhaps key employees or key employee group, or maybe a hybrid. But the important question to ask is the who. And sometimes it gets a little more complicated when you're dealing with children. If you have children, some are active in the business and some are not active in the business. So how do you deal with those sort of dynamics in a family? The second question that must be asked by the owner is the when. When does the owner want to start to scale back a little bit of their time and start assigning roles and responsibilities to other folks in the organization? And when does that owner want to then completely depart from the business? So that when's very important because that provides us timing for the departure, and that helps us in the planning process. The third question, which is paramount as well, is the how much. How much does the business owner need to fulfill their retirement obligations and their financial independence? And I think working with a personal financial planner is really important. That personal financial planner can help determine what the financial needs are post-retirement. And again, with longevity nowadays, there's a lot of concern about making sure that the owner has enough money to maintain their financial independence. There are also some secondary objectives as well that are important that the owner needs to ask to help design a comprehensive plan. One of the questions is, do you want to, whatever the design of the exit plan is, or the succession plan, is it going to benefit key employees? And again, as we talked about, which family members? Should the value be discounted? If you've got as an example, a child who's been in the business for 10, 15 years and has been very much responsible, a part of the growth and development of the company, does it make sense to discount the value for their sweat equity? Family harmony. If you've got business active and non-business active children, how can you maintain harmony in the succession plan so that you can meet the needs of all your children and maintain that harmony? Also, passing wealth with minimal tax consequences as a family unit, as a family group. How can we structure this so that it's sort of tax friendly, so to speak? Perhaps perpetual legacy is important to the owner. making sure that the name on the door remains in the family for some period of time. So that's important too, is how important is legacy in the mind of the owner. And community presence. For some owners, making sure that it's a local business, it stays local, jobs are local, facilities are local, may be very important to the business owner in designing a plan. So again, I think we need to ask the who, the when, and the how much, and take into account those secondary objectives.
Great, thank you. Jeannine, ownership, which is really about the money, and management, which is about the operations, are both essential, but different terms for planning purposes. So should ownership and management succession run parallel, or should they be sequential?
I think that that's something that's very important to think about in succession planning. I think most of the time, successful entrepreneurs that started their own business and grew and created a successful operation have a very difficult time, obviously, transitioning away from that. It oftentimes is their life, it is their hobby. And so they think of the ownership and the management as one. And I think that it can help in jump-starting that transition if perhaps they separate the two. Again, I think that the natural thought process a lot of times is to begin with the management transition, the operations, the running of the company, and trying to transition that to a second tier, a second level, so that the owner can kind of step aside from the day-to-day and become maybe just a board member and the owner and look more strategically. However, I think that a lot of times the entrepreneur has a very difficult time with that. And I think that that sometimes if they were to consider an ESOP, for example, you can actually flip the table and transition the ownership, the financial side of it, and have the business owner continue in the management role for a number of years after that ownership transition happens. With an ESOP, it is selling the company to the employees, so you gain some liquidity for the selling shareholder. You gain succession for the company, legacy for the company. But a big part of the success of the company, both before and after the establishment of the ESOP, is the management. And so that sometimes allows the seller to remain as the CEO, remain active in management, and it helps jumpstart the transition because now you have this employee ownership, and all of the culture of the company becomes more of a, people take more ownership in their day-to-day, and that a lot of times allows that selling shareholder to then realize that it's okay for them to step away managerial-wise also.
Jeannine, I'm just going to follow up. Can you talk a little more about what an ESOP is?
So an ESOP is an employee benefit, and it's an employee stock ownership plan. What happens is it's a employee benefit plan, a qualified plan similar to a 401k. And what happens is the company establishes an ESOP, a benefit plan, and the selling shareholder or selling shareholders will sell all or part of the company to the ESOP. And the beneficiaries of the ESOP are the employees of the company. So there are no employee contributions made to the plan. It's completely funded by the company. And just for the fact that you worked at the company and earned wages in a given year, you will receive an allocation or start to grow an account balance inside this benefit plan.
Thank you. For Jim, the latest attempt to pass a healthcare bill failed.
You want me to explain how that?
Yeah.
I got a page in here with notes.
And Jim, as you can tell, will be able to fix the lost document very quickly and get that passed before Labor Day.
Friday, yeah.
The process failed,
Huge.
possibly because they didn't have the right people at the table. So can you talk a little bit about who should be sitting at the table, both internally and externally, in order to make a perpetuation and succession plan work?
Sure, thanks. So good morning, everybody. When I think about succession plan internally and externally in terms of people and who should be involved, I think about sort of rings, right? Circles. And so it begins, obviously, at sort of the innermost circle with the owner of the company and perhaps the designated person that you primarily think the leadership will be passing to. But it very quickly starts to expand to include all the owners of the business. So it depends obviously on the structure of the company, but all of the owners of the business, all of the children, everybody who's going to have a piece of it either today or in the future, all those adult children need to be involved and aware of the plans and the logic and why it is that you're doing what you're doing, what the decision is. You also want to include your key management and executives so that they start to understand what their role is. Usually there's a lot of anxiety when people start to see the owner and the founder of a business reach that stage where they're going to leave. And your goal on this stage is to really start to eliminate that anxiety. And you can do that best by communicating. Communicate. And so you really want to make sure those key managers understand what's going to happen, how the transition is going to look. You want to make sure that all of the new owners, all the adult children understand how it's going to look and what's going to happen and what the expectations are. And then ultimately their spouses, because anybody have a spouse, right? And so spouses sometimes have a different perspective on things, and they think that they deserve or you deserve more for some reason. And so it's really important to do that. So one of the really important things eventually in the process is the family meeting, where you get as many of the key impacted family members together as possible and really discuss what's happening and give an opportunity for everybody to talk through stuff. Externally, you need some help as well from some expertise. And obviously the situation varies depending upon where you're at and who you've been working with. But certainly a financial planner, particularly the financial planner for the selling shareholder, very important person to involve in the program because they're going to help you understand tax implications for you as well as your heirs in terms of how you want to structure things and go through options. So that your personal financial planner is an important part of that. Your attorney, particularly somebody like Tim who understands transactions and successions and all of the implications around it. So somebody like Tim to work through it. If you're going the ESOP route, that's going to drag in a bunch of experts with the ESOP, both legal and financial, who are going to be supporting it. A lot of times companies who are going through this will also have a banker involved. So if you've got a big commercial loan outstanding, if you're in an industry where there's a lot of bonding and you've got bonding agencies involved, you're going to have to find that those people are engaged in the process and understand it and starting to look at the wealth of the new shareholders and make sure there's going to be a smooth transition. And then if you've got outside leadership coaches or consultants or strategic coaches who've been helping you with the business, they should be involved in starting to teach and pass wisdom and knowledge on to the next generation. And then finally, it's really helpful. How many of you have ever passed a business to the next generation? Right. See, we do it how many times in our life? Right, once. So we don't really know what we're doing the first time around and the only time that we do it. So it's really good to have somebody guiding that process. And that could be one of those outside experts that I've talked about before, an attorney, an accountant. I forgot to mention your accountant. Sorry, Dave. You need that accountant, really critical. But also really important that you find some kind of a guide. It could be one of those, or it could be somebody who just specializes in succession planning to lead and coordinate that whole process and step you through it. So it's a lot of resources to assemble when you're going to go through this.
Let me ask this as a follow-up. Have you ever seen a psychologist or a family counselor at the table?
Absolutely, and that's typically, they're in one of those two roles, right? And often you'll see a family psychologist or an outside leadership development person who's been in trying to help create the environment and help the new generation of leadership reach the point where they can take over. And it's just natural for them to then guide through it. They also will be involved if there's conflict. Believe it or not, sometimes the next generation doesn't all see eye to eye about who should be in charge or who should have what ownership. And you start to get some of this happening. And that outside psychologist and family counselor can really help get through some of those issues. I mean, the end goal, obviously, is that we have a nice, peaceful succession and that everybody's happy and still wants to come to dinner at Christmas and Thanksgiving. And that if there's strife, that counselor is really important.
Good point. From a prior experience, my entire career has been in and around communications within the business environment. And it was interesting, Jim was talking about the need for communication. I work with a bank that is no longer here, so, as so many banks
Not
aren't.
surprising.
But this particular bank, I was engaged by the management team to come in, and they were moving their facilities from downtown Portland, where they had been since inception, I mean, over 100 years, out of town. And so they said, we need help communicating for those who are going to be moving out of town. What does this all mean? So I said, great. And I said, and who's up to speed on this? Well, most everybody is. We still have to work down with the folks on the floor, but everybody pretty much knows their role. I said, great. So trust but verify. So I did a poll within the bank. The people sitting outside the management's office didn't know if they were staying or going. It was this incredible gut check to say, all right, do people really understand their stake in the change, and are they fully aware? Because one of the things I learned out of the Institute for Civic Leadership as well is that you need to start almost every single meeting by looking around and saying, who's missing? And recognizing the stake and when that person needs to come into the process is extremely important. Because otherwise you're going to end up paying outside advisors, psychologists, a lot more money and time for lack of that planning in terms of who should be at the table and why and what do they need to hear. So let me move back to David for a second. What are some of the key barriers, both financial and non-financial, that get in the way of starting a succession plan, and what kind of timeline does it take to get a good succession plan in place?
Well, in our experience, there are a few factors in terms of, some of the barriers to start the process. We find over the years that, owners don't have a lot of outside interest, that their primary interest is their business. They've been working on it 10, 20, 30 years, working 6, 7 days a week, maybe, raising a family, and they don't have a lot of external activities to keep them occupied. So there's a real sense of uncertainty that when they do leave, what are they going to do? So there's a real fear there. Owners, don't want to think about retirement and their own mortality, which we kind of brought up earlier, and everybody's going to live forever. And, I'm certainly in that boat as well. Owners unwilling to relinquish control and develop successors, right? You've got a business owner who's always been in control, made all the decisions, and the thought of actually relinquishing control makes a lot of owners very uncomfortable. And developing a successor, there's a fear of developing a successor and have that successor leave and compete against your company. So there's always a fear of trading your competition. We all know owners working in their business, not, working in their business, not on their business, so involved in the day-to-day operations that they don't have to think about taking a step back and really thinking about the future of their organization. Fear of running out of money after the exit. As we all know, once that departure takes place, once that financial event takes place, then the faucet is somewhat turned off. And now with people living longer, not necessarily improving the quality of life, but certainly the longevity of life, there's a lot of concern about, am I going to run out of money? And that's really a major fear, because they want to have financial independence and they don't want to go back to their children 10, 20 years ago, 10, 20 years later and say, dear son, dear daughter, can you lend a helping hand? So there's a lot of fear there. Owners are aware of transfer options and the perceived complexity and cost of doing the transactions. And what I explain to people is the cost of not planning far exceeds the cost of planning significantly, if not exponentially. So it's really important that the advisor team helps owners explore those various options and sort of take the mystery out of succession planning, because there really is no mystery to it. The other thing is dealing with family succession issues, family dynamics, dealing with business and non-business children. How can you transition the business when you have multiple children and still maintain that harmony? So as Jim says, they're still looking forward to making their way to Christmas every year. It's really, really important to maintain that glue within that family unit. And I think Jim alluded to earlier is owners don't know what to ask and how to start the process. How do you kickstart your succession plan? And I kind of talked earlier about asking, owners need to ask themselves those 3 very important questions. And that really is sort of the catalyst to start this off. But before anything happens, to get to the point of asking those 3 questions is the owner mentally prepared? Are they ready to go through the process? And that by far is really the most important task, because most of these barriers that I've run through, they're really more emotional than they are practical or financial. A lot of business owners have accumulated adequate wealth. So sometimes it's getting through that emotional hurdle, and without going through that emotional hurdle, there's nothing we can really do as an advisor other than to try to provide some guidance and maybe some storytelling to show, what are some of the bad things that can happen when you don't to successfully plan.
Can I just add to that point is that one of the things I see with this succession planning is that it's like anything else that's big and gnarly and you've never done it before and it's hard to understand. It's really easy to procrastinate it. There's always something more urgent, maybe not more important, but there's always something more urgent for you to go work on than succession planning. So it's easy to just kicking it down the road. So what I always try to do with people, and everybody describes the steps in different ways, but what I always try to do with everybody is make it easier to start eating the elephant by defining some discrete areas and then challenging people to just start working on them one at a time over the course of whatever an appropriate time frame is. So the 4 areas, of course, are first leadership and what we're going to do with people. Second is ownership, and fundamentally, how is ownership going to change? Third is legacy and your values, your culture, and how you want that passed on for the company to continue. And then 4th is wealth transition and cash flow for yourself. And so if you think about it, exit succession planning is needing to touch those 4 buckets, and these guys might have 1 or 2 different or describe them differently, but however it is, then you can start to set goals for yourself that says, all right, for the next 6 months, I'm going to work on this leadership thing. And I'm going to work really hard on how to develop people and who I'm going to develop and what that's going to look like. And then 6 months after that, I'm going to start working on this wealth piece of this. Let's try to make the elephant a little bit easier to eat is really important for the succession plan stuff, because otherwise it just looks like a really big, gnarly problem.
Which brings us to the war stories. We're going to turn to Tim, can you talk a little bit about a family business situation where they started the process and it shut down, it did not go further, and what got in the way?
Yes, thanks, Tony. I've had a number of stops and starts in this process. So a little background first. I represent a number of family-owned businesses. I may have started them. I came in later as corporate counsel. Where I find the first sticking point is, what do I do first? How do I start this thing? And if they come to me, and they could come to any of different advisors, if they come to me, they really are saying, I need a will. I need a will. And then that just pulls everything in with it. So like Jim, I try to make it easily digestible. Let's talk about a will. And then that may proceed to a discussion about a shareholder agreement. You know, do you even have a shareholder agreement in place? And then the basic, do you have the basics in place? If you have a shareholder agreement, do you have funding for the shareholder agreement? And then usually it's funding in case of death. The basic documents that should be in place are a shareholder agreement with life insurance as a funding source upon death. And then you can build on these things and bring all these other concerns in. But I agree with both David and Jim talked about, there's a lot of anxiety that is in, whether it's stated or unstated. So the first sticking point I see is how do I get started? And it's usually in the context of, I need a will. My wife and I need a will. My husband and I need a will. And so again, it's just try to start the process. And ultimately it gets to a point where there is a team, and the accountant is critical. The lawyer is critical. Outside consultants, if in various forms, with an ESOP, there are a number of people that need to be brought in. But it may start with any one of us. But I'm just saying, this is how it starts with me, is I usually need somebody says I need a will. Where do I see some other places where people get stuck? Jim already alluded to it. You got to get them in the room. I've had a couple of situations where the shareholders started out as two brothers, and then one brother got bought out, and then a nephew came in and was given stock. So the older brother was bought out. And so there was a fairly involved process to get to that, but then there was a relatively long payout. So it was basically the business that was funding the payout. And it wasn't an ESOP, it was just an agreement to sell the stock for installment shares. So that left behind a brother and a nephew. And then, did they have a shareholder agreement? No. So try to get them in to come in and talk about a shareholder agreement in that context. So obviously the nephew's father was the one that was bought out. So, and in that situation, I could figure out what his concern is, wait a minute, if I enter into some buyout agreement with my uncle, I'm the only one left that's carrying this weight, to buy the building, buy the business out. And that really provided some, real concern on his part. But teasing that out in the context of a discussion with these folks was important. It ended up, they recognized, we talked about it, they recognized that there was cash flow that was already being diverted to the father. And it was only a year or two until that was done. And then they said, well, we've lived without that cash flow for a while. Maybe we can live without it for some more time. And basically they diverted that into the equivalent of what's called a sinking fund to fund the buyout of the uncle. Now, the uncle was 8 years younger than the father. And then the nephew was 20 years younger than the uncle. And so we tried to get a step, but it was try to get that unstuck was one example of things that I see where people get stuck, and it can center around cash flow. How do I deal with the cash flow? And then just getting it started. But it arose in the context of a shareholder agreement And so I usually say will, shareholder agreement, those just can open the doors to all kinds of discussions. And then that's where you build your team, you can work. I had another one, and this one is still stuck, and I don't know if it'll get unstuck. So parents own all the shares, one son, no daughters, no other siblings, was 40 years old, and the parents were in their late 60s, but everybody's healthy, and they wanted to get out, and the son wanted them to get out, and they all talked about the desire to let them get out. So we basically talked about how can we help that happen. And in this case, it was fairly clear there was insufficient cash flow to support all these people. And it doesn't, kicking that down the street doesn't help anybody. So you just got to identify it. And so it was identified. But there was also, in the course of this discussion, I noticed that there was something else going on that was unstated. The son was divorced and he was remarried. And I don't know if I'm right or not, but I detected in the parents not a warm and fuzzy feeling about the new daughter-in-law. And this is the kind of family stuff that just gets you got to deal with. You got to deal with it. And that is a very tricky one to deal with. And we didn't deal with it at that meeting. We just identified the cash flow, but I'm not a psychologist. I don't want to get in there with that kind of thing. But before I turn it back to Tony, I just want to say one thing about, you're going to run into this with lawyers, and you're going to run into this with lawyers. They're always going to say, who's my client? And this is important for you to know, because you say, all right, wait a minute, does everybody have to have a lawyer here? And so you got 4 or 5 lawyers, and then the whole thing gets stuck. But you have to be aware of this, because the bar rules in any state basically say the lawyer has to represent a client, one client. Can't represent multiple clients if can only represent multiple clients when there's no potential conflicts of interest. So in that situation with the brothers and the uncle, I'm corporate counsel, and we did get that shareholder agreement in place. And I proposed, they had an estate planning attorney, both of them had an estate planning attorney. And I said, here's what I'll do. I will put together something, knowing what you all want, and try to put it into a shareholder agreement. And then you guys run it by your estate planning attorneys. But you're going to run into this, and you better know it now, that lawyers have to represent one client and can't do the whole family, although some try to do the whole family. And I will say that the problem with that is, and this is the important part, is that if something goes awry after a plan, it is an easy lawsuit to say, I was inadequately represented, I didn't have counsel, and they can blow the whole thing up. So I basically say, let's try to do this in the most efficient way. Somebody take the lead, one lawyer take the lead. And usually it's a corporate counsel, but then get and document that the other parties are represented. And there's got to be, a little consent and waiver agreement and all that. But I am sensitive to the idea of multiple lawyers. First of all, there's cost, but then the other thing is you get a couple lawyers in the room, and again, it can be, people can get stuck just by that. So, but most of us, I would say, are trying to do the right thing by our clients and want to do it in an efficient manner. And communication is key to help with the stuckness.
You touched on a couple things, and I'm going to open this to the panel. love and money. Love and money are two essential factors in figuring out what am I going to do with the business. And you've got children who, for some, it's not about the money. It's about, Mom, Dad, do you love me? And do you love me more than Johnny or Debbie? And what do you do in order to sort of work through the love side of it, knowing that the money is maybe secondary?
I always say that whenever we're dealing with the succession play within the family business, the most important party to the transaction is the company. Oftentimes these are leverage type of transactions where mom and dad may have an annuity for life. So what's most important is to maintaining, profitability, sustainability, cash flow of the business. So I think that is really, really paramount. And you really have to start with that to make sure that whatever the design is, we have to make sure that it's very friendly to the company. And I think that's certainly a good starting point. And I think Tim and I had a bit of a conversation last week, as I sometimes I use the word brutally honest, and perhaps it's a bit strong, but I think that getting the family together in a room, I think sometimes having a facilitator sometimes makes a lot of sense, or it could be a family friend, doesn't necessarily have to be an advisor, but someone who's trusted and being perceived as non-biased. And I think what we're trying to do is pull out any objections, any concerns that any family members have, put it out on the table, do it obviously in a respectful way, but, explain to people, if you don't speak now, this is going to haunt you for the next 10, 15, 20 years, and sometimes there's no turning back with some of these decisions. So I think I do like to use the word brutally, honest, because I think sometimes it can be a very difficult conversation to have, but it's got to be heard.
I'm the one who raised the objection to the brutally. It is about honesty, and it's about stating your concerns. Now that, and I'm sure others will comment on that, some people are unwilling or unable to speak their concerns, and then that's another thing that gets you stuck. And how do you do that? I mean, a facilitator, David mentioned a trusted friend, somebody who is perceived as fair and unbiased, and who can help. Again, it's a teasing out. I'm all for the honesty. I'm not sure the brutality is the way to go, but tease it out. Keep working it, and it can be a process.
Okay. I don't know that I have anything. It's really complicated. The love and money thing tends to be really simple if we're talking about a small company that doesn't have much money. And then nobody really cares. And it's like, yeah, whatever you want to do, Dad, is fine. Give it to my brother. I don't really care. People suddenly care when there's a lot of money. And it gets more complicated, and suddenly love is less important and money becomes more important, or something. I think the key point that I would add in here is that as the money goes up and the number of people go up, the complexity increases exponentially. And that's where I think what Tim just said is really critical. If you bring a group of 9 or 10 interested parties together and you try to have an open and honest or brutally honest conversation together, it's not going to happen, because there will be somebody with a very strong dominant personality in the room who just drives the conversation and drives the direction and kind of steps on everybody's feelings and everybody's toes. And because there's generally been lots of 30, 40 years of family dynamics going on, and everybody's sort of got their role to play in the family, that person with the personality that's a little more quiet, a little more reserved, who knows that their role is to sit at the end of the table and be seen and not heard, they just sit there quietly stewing. And because you have that happening, it's really important, I think, to get that outside psychologist, maybe a family friend, but it's a family friend who knows what they're doing, to meet individually with people and really ask the question, what do you want out of this? What's important to you with this? And what is that importance relative to money, but also what's important to you relative to a role in the company and then role relative to ownership, because some people identify their own identity as an owner of this business, and it's very important to them that they be associated with it as an owner. And they may not be interested in running it and being a part of it, but they want that ownership and they want that family recognition. Other people are mostly worried about the money, and there are many ways we can deal with money. They don't need to have a piece of the business. They might get some real estate from somewhere else. Kind of like a divorce, there's creative ways to balance out and equate the money. So it does get complicated. I think what you'll find is if it's a small business, really small business, and there's not a lot of money, love wins, right? As soon as it gets to be a lot of money, love starts to get pushed aside, money takes over, and it gets harder.
Cynical but true.
It's funny, hang on for just a second. If any of you went to Eggs and Issues, I'm going to say about 6 months ago, when Sean Corman talked about Albin, great example on a mega level of an extended family trying to figure out people's stake and how do you behave as owners in multiple generations. One of the things that came to mind in that discussion, though, is as was demonstrated not too long thereafter, after the election, was a family member who took a very visible public stand. And so protecting your brand, likewise, is extremely important because you don't want the outside world to see conflict. They want to see a company that they depend on, that works, and has lasting value to them. So this is, again, planning helps you do that. It makes certain that your values as a company are perpetuated and that your customers don't see a ripple other than the plan that you have in place to grow the business.
I was just thinking the valuation, just what you were talking about, Jim, sometimes having a valuation, so the money thing, there's at least a number on the table, can help pull people together and understanding that, okay, I think it's worth $4 million and it's really only worth $1 million. And that seems to be another thing that can be a barrier to having done for your business because of cost or other reasons.
So how big the pie is. Peter?
Yeah, Tony, thanks. I'd like to hear the panel address, and Jim, I think you touched on it a little bit. In terms of the seller's fear of change and addressing or soothing the loss of control, how do you deal with that fear of change and the loss of control?
Dave, you were touching on some of that.
Yeah, I think that's where you come in and you play psychiatrist. We talked a little bit earlier, some of the barriers, and certainly some of the barriers are more emotional rather than practical or financial. And it's bad, getting back to my point earlier, is that nothing is going to drive the plan until the owner is sort of mentally prepared, that preparedness to it. And that's the challenge sometimes. And I think as advisors, we are sometimes guides, and sometimes we sort of help guide through some of the reasons as to what would happen if you didn't plan, and kind of bring them to the dark side, so to speak. And not to necessarily use fear, but just to use real common sense. These are the reasons why you should. But I do find though that sometimes that it's difficult for us because you're getting into the family dynamics, and sometimes it's helpful to have an outside party, a business, a coach, a mentor, or someone that's on that side that's perceived as being trusted and biased, to help sort of walk through or help them through some of those emotional obstacles. But that's just it's such a major challenge.
One of the things I do with that control issue is I send owners away. So I've got a client right now who's got a place in Maui and a place in South Carolina, both of which are nicer to spend January and February in Maine. And so for the last couple of years, we've been sending him away and go to Maui. The fishing's pretty good in Maui in January. It's not so good in Maine. So that's been a pretty easy call. So let's go away for a month, 6 weeks, and let go and see what happens and see how you start to feel, because it's one of these things that creeps up on some people where they finally realize, there is a better life than just running this business all the time. And I do have people who can actually run this thing without me, and I was gone for 8 weeks and nothing bad happened. So it is kind of testing.
Chris?
Just a practical question. Where children are, or adult children are remote and not necessarily communicating to each other about the business, what's a way to draw them into like a family council or, you're almost mentioning like a mediation scenario where all parties aren't necessarily open to it. If they're remote, maybe living abroad, maybe living in other places, not necessarily with varying levels of interest in the business that you mentioned, but what's a way to draw them in without making it mandatory, so to speak? Or do you have to make it mandatory?
I will just say one thing on that. I actually have had situations where there was a penalty for not showing up. And it was needed. I mean, there are situations where, you can get some passive or passive aggressive people and you just need to address that. But obviously encouraging people to be grown up and really, take some responsibility for this important discussion. This is, all of us being grown-ups and, trudging through this, process. But I know there are other ways too.
I wish I knew what they were.
Yeah, I know.
The only experience I have is I've got a family that has 4 children, 2 active, 2 non-active, and they go on vacation once a year. And it's a set time, go on vacation once a year. And some of it's certainly pleasure, but there's an agenda as well. And that's the experience I have in terms of bringing people together, and typically it's out of country.
We've usually invited and asked and cajoled everybody to come. Often what I've seen is that sadly it's death or other tragedy that actually finally forces the issue and brings everybody in. So we try to create urgency short of death to try to get people motivated to come in. That's fundamentally it. When we have people away who aren't motivated to come in, we're trying to create urgency just short of that.
Assassins Are Us did not show up.
This is for Tim specifically. You were telling a story about the 2 parents and the son and cash flow.
Yes.
So you lead me to believe at least that the parents have sunk all of their financial future into the business and don't have any kind of investments on the side relative to retirement. So they're planning on keeping a paycheck while their son runs the business.
That is accurate. And that is unfortunately, and this is where advisors early on, and particularly accountants who can pitch the tax advantages of, retirement savings, is important. But in that case, they had some, but it was inadequate. And we're trying to get them money in a tax efficient manner. I mean, that's what we try to do is, there's more dollars left over if you plan for taxes. In this case, we didn't want them to have a paycheck. We wanted them to have rental payments, which aren't subject to FICA and things like that. So, I mean, there are things that we can do, but you're right. In that particular case, they did not have adequate savings.
Is there another question back here? Yes, Steve.
Oh, most of you are talking about involving a lot of people in this process, and I think that's sort of an understood standard for those that work on succession planning. It's not natural for a lot of folks, a lot of business owners. There's been 1 or 2 people that have been running the company. And so you're suggesting they swing from one extreme to the other. And you're also talking about involving, a lot of people are listed. If you add up everyone that the 4 of you listed, it's a lot of people. Is there a point at which you say, I'm not quite sure my question, is there a point at which you say, look, you make the decision, just do it. Forget about consulting with everyone, do the best you can. Is there a point at which you just inform people and say, this is what my decision is, so they all understand the rationale, as opposed to consulting with them?
Sounds like the brutal question.
Yeah, and maybe and if you do want to involve a lot of people, how do you get there? There's a massive chasm.
So how do you get there? I actually find that people get, if they have too many choices, you've all heard this. If you have too many choices, you make no choice, right? So the objective is not to sit down with people and say, you're going to need these 8 advisors and you're each going to need a lawyer and this is how this is going to go. Once we go there, everything stops, right? So what we try to do instead, what I try to do instead anyway, is just step through the process. And it's why I suggested as somebody who does succession planning, has been there before and can be a guide. They will bring in the experts as you need them. And so we start the conversation around, if we're working on finance, we start the conversation around, do you have enough assets? Do you really need money out of this business? And if so, how much? Don't know? Great. Let's sit down with your accountant and let's sit down with your financial planner and let's do some math. And we work on that. We're not talking about all the pictures, we're just talking about this. And then we start talking about employees and who's going to manage and run the business and their readiness and their state and their ability to do that. And if we see weaknesses, then we say, okay, well, who can we bring in that's going to start helping that person improve their readiness? And then if we start talking about an ESOP, then we start going over here. When we discover that there is no documentation for any of this, we're calling the lawyer. So instead of laying out the whole path and making it big and gnarly and scary, we just start discreetly guiding and working through, and then it's not so scary.
Yeah, similarly, I mean, usually a context that arises, and I mentioned this before, is the owners want to come in and have a will. And so that does, get the process going. At some point you may need some meeting or at least of the people who are going to be involved in the business, but it really needs to be, once they start the will, they identify, who's going to be in the business, family members, who's not. How do you want to treat them fairly? Okay, how can we do that? And again, that just is an opening that can help, can get the thing started. And they do, it's short of death, but it's getting them thinking about death. What's this going to look like after I'm gone? And that just, again, pulls all kinds of stuff out.
I'm going to go off script for a second. There are a number of people that appear to be under the age of, let's say, 45 in the room, which is great. That's why you're here. Mom and I'm thinking about a Twilight Zone episode. I'm dating myself. Grandpa died, but he kept on coming downstairs for breakfast, and they had to convince him that he was dead. What do you see as? What do you see?
Never had that one happen yet. Gonna put that out there.
What do you see? What do you see in terms of kids who are saying, "Mom, Dad, it's time," and they won't let go? What roles have you played in helping them say, okay, time to go? I mean, I've got a friend who's well into his 80s at this point. He just can't let it go, and he's got kids in the business. What do you do? What do our young prospective owners do or say to Mom and Dad?
I like Jim's answer about getting him to go to Maui fishing. Seriously, I mean, wait a minute, I don't have to worry about all this. The business is running. Now, there are still people who can't let go and won't go to Maui. And you do what you can. You try to talk to them, you try to encourage them to, and frankly, I appeal to their, their legacy. You want to make sure this business continues, right? And and we need a plan, and then you need to train your management or your children to take over. But there's no guarantees, you're going to be successful with that or not. Depends on the personality.
Yeah, if they have that big immortality complex and they want to just run it till they die, I actually am okay with that. And if that's ultimately where they're at, and I've got clients who are there, I'm okay saying, fine, if this is what brings you joy and what you really want to do and what you want to drive, and as long as you have the energy and you're sane and it's in the best interest of the business, knock yourself out. And you are not immortal. So we need to do all this other work so that on that day that they do haul you out feet first, there's everything in place and we have that smooth succession and everything is put together. Now that's easier in a smaller business than in a larger business, because the larger it gets, the more complicated that would be. But if everything is in place so that we know how this business is going to continue and people have the skills and the knowledge and everything, resources, I'm okay letting that person who really wants to stay there, I'm okay reinforcing that. On the flip side of that, when I'm working with the younger generation, there are times when you just need to go away. And maybe it's not your time in that business and you need to go get some experience somewhere else and come back in 5 years. And I've had that scenario as well, where mom and dad are in their 50s and they got 20 years left if they really think they're going to be in this business. And you're just that young Turk charging ahead and trying to push them out. And maybe you need to go somewhere else for a few years, but maintain the relationship so that you're invited back in 5 years. So every situation can be different, but sometimes that's the answer too.
I usually recommend grandchildren. Yeah. If you have to adopt grandchildren, that's fine. But whatever it takes, or perhaps you send those grandchildren out of state. But I do find that
Maui.
Maui's fine. And I find that sometimes expanding families, sometimes it can be enough to especially get the spouse putting a little more pressure on the patriarch to try to deal more time with the family. And I think sometimes getting over that barrier in terms of finding out the control. What is it really? What's the underlying issue? Is it purely a control because they feel they can't separate themselves from the business, or perhaps it's purely financial? And we've had some situations where we've done some very much advanced, comprehensive financial modeling, and sometimes we just got to demonstrate to the owner that we've got a 99.9% certainty that you will not run out of money. And I think if you can demonstrate that, then sometimes they just need to hear that just to let go. So again, you have to find out what the root cause of that control is. And if I can just go back a little bit to Steve's comment and make sure I understood you properly, I just wanted to make one last quick comment, is that there's certainly got a lot of team of advisors, by the complexity of the case, particularly if you're getting into an ESOP or multiple children scenario. I always tell people when it comes to driving an exit plan, it's critically important that you have a Tom Brady on the team. You have to have a quarterback. That quarterback doesn't have to be the attorney. It could be an accountant. It could be an advisor. It could be even a family friend. There has to be a quarterback, and everybody on the advisor team has to understand who the quarterback is, so that you're really simplifying the process. So necessarily being directly involved with 10 advisors or 5 advisors, perhaps you can just streamline it so you have one person that's really kind of going through the discovery process, collecting data, getting other opinions, suggestions, and whatnot, but out that the day all funnels through that one quarterback to the family, so you're hearing one voice and not 5 voices or 6 voices, particularly if those voices don't necessarily convey the same message. Then you got an owner, talk about getting stuck, you're just going to shut down. So I always recommend is make sure that everybody agrees upon who the quarterback is.
Right, let me move to the an interesting question, again, for those who are sort of under the 45 line. Jim, what should people be doing who are owners to get their kids prepped? What's the training look like? What are the recommendations that say, all right, here are your strengths, here are your weaknesses, how are we going to make this happen, or do you have to go away?
So in some cases, you do need to go away. because you can learn in different ways and then come back. But that's not always required, and it's not always an option. So what's important is you bring kids in, and if you're one of those kids, is make sure you're working in a role that's commensurate with your current abilities. So make sure that person is doing a job that is appropriate, and they should be reporting to the appropriate manager in the company. I've got a client right now who doesn't agree with me on that point. So he's got the kids doing roles that are commensurate with their responsibility or with their abilities, but he has them all reporting to him as the CEO of the company instead of to the department heads. And that's just silliness. It's created nonsense in the organization. So it's really important that they learn how to report to somebody, that they work for somebody who can help them and can guide them and teach them and show them on a daily basis. So make sure they report to the right person. Where they need skill development, don't be afraid to send them outside to training programs. There's a lot of things available through IFOB and all kinds of other places. When you're looking at them, make sure that you're looking at them and saying, it's great that they are really good at doing this thing. And in the future, they need to understand a bit about accounting. So I want them to go to an accounting for non-financial managers course. And they're going to need to know about how to lead. And so I'm going to send them to leadership courses. And they're going to need to know a little bit about kind of marketing and strategy. So I'm going to find some kind of marketing and strategy place for them to go to. So it's not just what they're doing right now that I'm focused on, but where are they ultimately going to be, and how am I going to give them the skills and those experiences? As they start to develop and learn more, then I want to give them more responsibility and more accountability, let them have some autonomy and try some things. Hopefully they'll fail a little bit because you learn more from failing than succeeding. So I need to be willing to let them do that. Expose them as well increasingly to some of the decision making at a strategic level, so they come into some strategic meetings with you. They don't necessarily have a voice at the table at first, but let them sit there and start to understand the process. But then as you're making decisions, you as the owner and the leader, it's really important that you're explaining the why. Why is it that you're making the decisions that you're making? Ask their opinions. What do you think we should do? And explain what you want to do and why it is that you want them to do it that way. Get them thinking through stuff. Last point that I would say is that I see a lot happen is that young person comes into the business and they're very focused on the thing, whatever it is we're doing. They're focused on manufacturing, or they're focused on sales, or they're focused on some aspect of what it is that we deliver. And they get really, really good at that. And then we say, aha, you're ready. And of course they're not, because what they really need to learn how to do is how to lead and take care of the culture and take care of the legacy of the business and how they're going to manage people. So it's really important that you're evaluating them on their ability to run an organization, to be a team captain, to be a leader of a group, because that's the most important skill in the long run for them. So really pay attention to that.
It's interesting. My mom told me years ago that when she was watching the chairs of the United Way campaign, they were all slaughtered for succession. They were the next generation of leadership in their organizations. So another way is that you can export some of these skills to outside civic organizations where, without consequence to your business, they can exercise leadership. But in that sense as well is that as you take a look at civic engagement, it gives them also a very high profile in the community, which may be just what you need for perpetuation of the business as well. Maybe within a trade association. Trade associations are great where you can network, you can get into your own peer group, you can learn from the older folks, again, without jeopardizing the mothership, which is the business. They get the skill sets they need in order to make this legacy work.
Yeah, I'm just wondering if you had any words of wisdom for a next generation, someone that's been involved in the family business for 20 years in a revenue generating capacity, that the father and the father's partner, there's no plan. And here's the son who's been with the company for 20 years and looking at his dad and his partner that are well into their 70s now, and there's been no discussion at all. And just wonder if anybody had any words of wisdom on how, if you were that child.
Hypothetically.
Hypothetically.
It's a friend.
I do run into this, and I have that exact same scenario in that it's the father and a partner that own it, and they will not talk about it.
Yeah.
And for whatever reason, they can't talk about it among themselves, or they can't talk down. But I mean, I always say the accountant is a good head of the spear to try to get this prodding. They're actively involved on an ongoing basis, and they can push the financial reasons to do this, which may push other reasons to do this. So, you know, the lawyers we get in on a kind of a transactional basis, but the accountants are in on a annual basis and can be more helpful in that type of situation.
Again, I think it goes back to, you know, why don't they want to talk about it? I mean, it's uncover the why. You know, is it financial? Is it the perceived complexity of it, the cost of it? Is it something that unresolved issues? I think it comes down to airing out the grievances. You know, and I think that's where it starts. I mean, it's got to start from somewhere to find out the why. You know?
Yeah, I like Tim's answer, which is enlist others, so that it's not your friend coming in and trying to push them out, but that it's somebody else who's an outside expert like the accountant. I've seen Dave do this a couple times where Dave makes this an issue for that older generation, and that starts the whole process going. So Dave is really good at that.
Yes, in the back.
I wonder if you could speak for just a second, if any of you have any advice about ways to consider long-standing employees in succession plans. And by considering, I think what I mean is, how do you avoid issues where, for example, in a company where you're creating a succession plan so that your own children are going to get the business, but you might have had an employee who worked for you for 20 to 25 years, so, you know, do they ever get in the way? They're going to go, wait a minute, you're going to give this to a 35-year-old? I don't know, how do you talk a little bit about making sure your employees all understand the plan? Are there ever?
Are you talking about an employee who has management potential?
Yeah.
Okay, it's not just all the employees. Dave and I are working on a situation right now where the owner is the owner and one child, and the owner is going to give all the stock to the son upon death, and the son knows that. But there are a couple other, one in particular, management personnel that really will work with the son probably. And so one of the things we've suggested is, first, this is a situation where there's voting and non-voting stock. It's an S corporation. Setting up something where you give a share of the non-voting to each of the, one share to the son and one share to the non-family member. You have to have ways to recapture that if things go sideways. But it's, you own a little piece of the company. You're in the plan. Before you do this, you want to make sure they are in the plan. And it's a way, and then you can have a shareholder agreement, and you can buy insurance to fund a buyout, probably not of the parents, but between the two younger generation members. But you got to find out, is this person the person? A person or part of the management team that's going to run the business. And once you make that decision, you might be able to use a tool like that.
I think it's a great question, and that question can probably elaborate. We probably have another session just on the tools that can be used, and certainly Tim discussed one of them. There's a lot of tools out there, particularly I like deferred compensation agreements. And that deferred compensation agreement could be sort of a handcuff to keep that key employee for a period of time, 60, 65. That deferred comp, the rules provide a tremendous amount of flexibility under the 409A rules. So you could fund it based on percentage of earnings, growth of the company. It could pay out at certain events, death, disability, voluntary and voluntary termination, those sort of things. So you kind of handcuff them. They feel that they're contributing to the organization, and perhaps you do want to give them maybe possibly a token ownership percentage, maybe for the purpose of contingency planning only. What happens if that son or that one daughter predeceases the matriarch or the patriarch? If you've got a minority owner that's funded with shareholder with life insurance, you have a market fee of shares. You have an instantaneous market fee of shares the day after. So perhaps it's contingency planning. If that person departs, then there's just a buyback provision or mandatory buyback provision that if you leave the businesses, I have to render my 1% of shares at $1 or whatever the case may be. So you got to figure out really what are your objectives, and what kind of tool should you use to meet those objectives. But there's a tremendous amount of options and tools available. That's the scenario. Great question.
I would just say that Dave and Tim are experts at all of the tools. The hard part is what's the outcome you want. So I would start with the owner and saying, what is the outcome that you want for the kids? And what is the outcome that you want for that employee or that group of employees? And then it gets back to that C word that we've talked about: communicate, 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 communicate. So this is what's going to happen. This is why it's going to happen. This is how I want this to go down. And then I bring in Dave and I bring in Tim and I say, okay, come up with some creative set of tools that gets me where it is that I want to go to. But it really starts with what's the outcome. I do find a lot of employees at family-owned businesses who are long-term employees, they actually understand very clearly that they're never going beyond a certain level. It's a family-owned business, and I've made a decision to work at a small family-owned business instead of Wright Express. Because I'll enjoy the various benefits that come from that, but it does mean there's a limit to what's going to happen, and I'm okay with that trade-off. So in a lot of cases, it's easy.
One of Jim's comments triggers a thought as well. This is what I would put in the world of perpetuation versus succession. Perpetuation, there may be somebody in your company who is utterly key, that person, that son that may be generating 80% of the revenue, while mom and dad or the partners are sitting back going to Maui, but won't make a decision. And with that, Virgin Islands, I'm sorry. Hypothetically.
One of the things that I did want to mention that we see with people that decide to set up an ESOP for their company is that obviously what we're talking about here is that it's very difficult to get the owner to have this conversation in the first place. And with an ESOP, it is more of a perpetual tool for the succession of the company. And it's not something that now you transfer to the next generation of the family. And this generation is now going to have to experience those same problems and heartaches and inability to deal with their succession planning. And I think a lot of times once you, it also aids in the management, if the management is non-family, dealing with that situation, that the ownership is not with the family member, but the management team that's non-family is really the driver behind the company. It is really sharing the ownership and sharing the accountability amongst everyone at the company, the family members and non-family members. And I think that a lot of our clients find that in the long run, once they can get over dealing with getting in and getting the financial answer to what's happening with the company, it allows them to deal with all of the emotional and leaving behind the actual management of the company at a slower pace. And it's easier for them to deal with once the finances are done and the ownership has changed.
I just want to follow up on that. I mean, a sale to an ESOP is essentially a sale to a third party, as opposed to a family. And that's important because that is, again, another choice. And it doesn't necessarily have to be an ESOP. It could be just to a strategic buyer, whatever. And, you know, I've had a number of clients who said, we can't grow anymore, or we don't want to do what it takes to grow anymore. It's too scary. I don't want to bet the farm on it. And they make a decision to sell to a third party. And one of them could be an ESOP. Another, hopefully, is a strategic buyer where you might get a premium for your sale. But I run into that also. It's the family is making a decision.
And Jeannine, can you talk a little bit more about ESOPs? And it doesn't have to be all or nothing, I understand. So can you dive in there a little bit?
Yeah, so an ESOP, you can either sell part of the company to an ESOP or all of it to the ESOP. And there's, you know, different reasons that family businesses decide to do each. And I think that even though it is a sale to a third party, the third party is really your employees. And so it allows you to continue the legacy, to continue on the board of directors, and really, you know, at having some control over what is going to happen at that company long term, as opposed to selling to a third party and losing complete control. For example, Spinnaker actually has an ESOP, and we have a partial ESOP, and it will always be a partial ESOP. We have a management team that has the ability to be able to become a partner, but there's also, obviously, in all companies, a part of the staff and a part of the company that will never reach that level. And so we have in our succession plan that that you are a member of the ESOP until you reach that point when you become a partner, and then you no longer are a part of the ESOP, and now your ownership is outside of the ESOP. And so therefore we share the ownership culture with all of our employees. And so I think a lot of times companies will decide, you know, to go that route because they do have the pride of the family ownership and they want to continue the family ownership, but they also, many family-owned businesses have the culture of shared ownership, shared accountability, shared responsibility for what happens to the company in the long run. And I think sometimes if they set up a partial ESOP and allow those allow the team, the employees that have driven the financial success of the business for the selling shareholder, if they allow them long-term to have a financial benefit through the ESOP ownership, I think that fits in very well with family-owned businesses. And I think there are, you know, Moody's is actually a perfect example of that, where it's a family-owned business. They have an ESOP and it has an amazing culture amongst its employees, and it really makes the non-family members feel like family members.
That's great. In that same vein, can you talk a little bit more about companies that would be best suited and perhaps those that would be ill-suited to look at ESOPs as a solution?
Basically, A company needs to have a strong management team because, again, as we discussed, it is a sale to a third party, but that third party is not a strategic buyer that is going to come in with a management team that's going to run this company. That's why we like to see that the selling shareholder wants to continue on managing the company for a period of time after the transaction happens, and or has a very strong management team in place to take over the business after they decide that they want to leave, because the overall success of the business and perpetuation of the business is still in the hands of the employee base that is there before the transaction happens. That being said, obviously the company needs to have a history of profitability in order for the company, like any company, in order for it to succeed, it needs to have earned profits in the past and have the future potential of continuing to earn profits, as well as have enough payroll and enough employees to be able to spread the value of the company over. Again, the IRS and the Department of Labor created ESOPs and the idea of ESOPs for widespread ownership. And there are a lot of tax advantages to the company and to the selling shareholder. And so therefore, they don't want abuses where you have a company that's owned by owned and run and only has, two or three individuals that own and work at the company and want to set up an ESOP for the tax benefits and basically spread the ownership over, 2 or 3 people. There are compliance tests that would create a failure, and the ESOP would, therefore all the tax benefits go away. You need to have a profitable company that has, enough individuals and payroll to spread the value of the company over. And I think also, as I said before, having an owner and a management team that really believes in employee ownership and the culture of employee ownership. If you, have one person leading the ship that doesn't want to relinquish any control or share control or ownership or, the decision making with other people, that will tend to not lead to a successful ESOP. A lot of what, the success of ESOPs is, basically, based on breeding that culture of ownership, and that it's not, an ESOP isn't necessarily just a financial tool to transfer the ownership.
Okay, we have a question from our remote panel up at Commerce College, and they're saying, what is the best way to handle dealing with multiple people in succession planning regarding equity when one or more children works in the business and others do not?
Okay.
Well,
That's actually a fairly common.
I think we'll wrap it up here.
It's actually a fairly common.
Thank you all.
Well, I think it ties into one of the things we were discussing beforehand is, what tools are there to help do that? And I'm, again, approaching it in the estate planning context. And so you want to give the you use business active versus non-business active. You want to give the non-business active children, for want of a better word, you want to give them something that they perceive to be fair. And I'm presuming that the parents want to treat their family fairly. And so there's a number of tools you can use, but one of them is usually you see a corporation that might have some real estate, but the real estate's in an LLC, and there's rent going back and forth, and there's a lender, but you might give shares in stock into the operating children and LLC interests in the non, and so they just collect money or rent. That's used a fair amount. There are also a host of trust things like grantor annuity trusts and other things that can be used to transfer or create liquidity for the non-active. So you end up with the equity owners tending to have non-liquid stock. And if you do it right and you plan it right, you can have some liquidity either to buy their shares out for the non-actives, and you would have them bound by a shareholder agreement to sell that. Life insurance is a piece of that planning process. And if it's an S corp, you can do the voting, non-voting stock piece. But the real estate is a good technique, and if the structure of the company is such that it has a real estate facility, you can use that, and that smooths a lot of edges in that context. Others?
Yeah, I'm going to go back to it's outcomes that you want. I've seen many cases where there's parents departing and there's some number of children inheriting, and some of them are in the company and some of them aren't in the company. And I've seen examples where the parents are like, they're not in the business, they're not getting any of it. They haven't worked at it, that's just my philosophy. Too bad, so sad. And that's what they believe, and that's how they communicate it, and the business and everything goes one direction, and maybe they try to equilibrate, if that's a word, the value of the estate in some other way. But it really is going to come back to what is it that departing parent values? What is it that they want to achieve? And if they can get clarity around that, then great accountants and lawyers can help you figure out a way to achieve it.
A couple of things come to mind. If you've got a situation where you've got an estate of 10 million, $5 million of the business, one active children, then you got $5 million worth of assets that you can carve out or allocate it to the non-business active. Those sort of scenarios, you have a lot of options to distribute those assets. It becomes more problematic if you've got a $5 million estate and the business worth is $4.9 million. Then it really becomes sort of a real difficult situation where how do you carve out the value for the non-business active children, to mention life insurance. Kind of running out of options there. The other option is having non-business active children receive some of the shares of the company, and obviously that brings up a whole host of other issues about having a business and non-business active children running a business, and perhaps we can either make it even more difficult by having it 50-50 with no tiebreaker. Then what do you do in situations where you've got a child that's been in the business for 10, 15 years and has enhanced the value of that business tremendously through their sweat equity, but they weren't compensated as an owner. So when you go to transfer that business or value that business, is it a discount? What kind of discount? What's fair? What's equitable? So those really make some real challenges. So balancing and doing those carve-outs of the estate is a really challenging process. Hence the importance of planning early, not planning late, because again, when we get to that dreadful day, we don't have a lot of options at the table at that time.
Right. Also, again, reflecting on where it's not all family, it may be partnerships and families on either side. And you may also have somebody who is in fact the key person in the operation that doesn't have an ownership interest at all, but is relied upon for sales or for technical issues. This is the perpetuation side that you need to tend to as well. It may be mom and dad, but it may also be somebody that's simply that key employee. Think about key person insurance, making sure that you can buy a replacement if it's non-proprietary information to that individual. Think about the fact that the children may not be prepared yet to take over the business, yet the bench scientist is the one that's really driving the business but doesn't have an ownership interest. So you need to engage in that discussion as well with your advisors to make sure that you've got the ability to perpetuate the business in the absence of their key assets. We're getting close to the hour, and I know that Catherine wants to do a wrap up. Is there anything that we haven't touched on that you want to, that's just that burning question? We really have pretty much exhausted the issues that we had discussed as a panel beforehand.
I would just, I think you pretty much covered it, but it seems like a lot of this succession planning gets stimulated for a lot of people when it's the first succession. You know, company's been 40 years and now it's time for mom or dad or whatever to move on. But at that time, how important is it to really try to plan the future succession? You know, which is kind of what you're talking about with perpetuation and whatnot. But I just kind of want to say it that way and see what we're
multi-generational.
Whoa.
They happen. They don't happen as often as people think they happen. I know there are stories of a number of companies in Maine that, you know, have several generations, but it doesn't happen. I mean, if you get to over the first generation, you're pretty good. But if you want to have some kind of legacy, I mean, you then have to plan with them, and they are the ones who really kind of have to drive the bus on that. You know, again, it could be a matter of restricting stock transfers. You know, and you can have restrictions on who can make a decision to sell. I mean, so there are things you can do to create a perpetual company, but it is something that I think is best left to organic process.
Here's a great analogy to that. Any of you folks have a family camp?
Oh, God.
All right, so you know, oh, the grandchildren have all their memories here. This is just so wonderful. I want all the grandchildren, great-grandchildren, and it's going to tree out all through all those families. Okay, well, I get third week in August, and you get December. It's much the same discussion.
And then you're owning it with your cousin.
Right, who lives in San Diego.
Right, and wants out.
Okay, so we see where that goes. Failing any additional questions, I want to thank the panel extremely for their great wisdom. I hope that you have found that you have not had billable hours this morning, but all the value that comes with it. And I want to turn it over to Catherine so that she can do the wrap up.
Thank you very much. You guys are great. I have a basket here that I will go around to get business cards, and then we will do our wrap up. So you want to put your card in.
You had the best thing. I think we're better looking group.
I know, it's like, I was like, I had that.
I think we could have, I think we're a much better looking group.
And I don't know if you saw, but they got our pictures up, there, but we
There we
weren't
go.
sitting in the right places.
Yes.
They did, yeah, he had the clicker over here.
Oh,
Up there, would have
Was
been
that you?
really good.
was that you?
It wasn't me.
No, and then the mix up with the order of the pictures?
It was, no, I just noticed that it wasn't, we messed that up. On the evaluation, say that the presenters
Yeah.
must sit underneath the
Is
pictures.
that right?
Oh, really?
Yes, it should be that good. Then we should be that good.
Yeah.
Right? That doesn't take much. So what's this?
No.
Away from finance.
Yes.
No, it's because they don't come to me there.
Yes.
You know.
Is Moody's partial ESOP or full?
Partial.
Partial, yeah. You know, how much?
I think it's still a minority,
Yeah.
you know, somewhere in the 30, 40, maybe,
yeah.
I'm not positive.
Yeah, I'm not sure. I'll call Sean at some point and talk to him about it, but yeah.
Yeah, he's
Yeah,
great.
he's awesome. I've done some work with him before, seminars with him and stuff, so.
Yeah,
But yeah, I talked to him at the event. He told me what he saw, but I didn't get into the
Right.
details, how much he's done, but yeah.
yeah. And I think, so there's different ways that you can do it, where
Mhm.
you can leverage the ESOP and borrow money to buy part of the company, or you can just make contributions into the plan every year and
Right.
buy the amount of stock that cash can purchase. And I believe that that's what Sean has done historically.
Right.
He hasn't leveraged the company.
Which is amazing. I mean, that's the best, I think, the best way to do it in terms of preserving the company.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I don't think that he has.
Right.
That's
And so
amazing.
again, there's so much flexibility with
Right,
it
yeah,
that, you know, people do it all different ways.
yeah. Cool, thank you.
All right, everybody ready? We will have Taylor, who is our new intern this summer, and has been a wonderful help for me. We'll let you pull the first one, and we'll go with the big basket first. There we go.
The good stuff.
Maureen has it.
Oh, Merry
Yay.
Christmas. And let me see, we have our husband, shirt, pull another one, yep.
Stephen H. Cherniak.
Yay.
Here, then we have our Starbucks,
Don Embry.
yeah. All right, and our highly coveted, hard to come by new IFOB hats, but one here.
John Thibodeau.
John Thibodeau, blue or stone?
Hey.
Choice. And the last one,
Jonathan Mapes.
oh! All right, thank you all, and you please stay, we have plenty of refreshments and things, and I'll take a quick picture of this.
Quick picture.
Oh, take a look at it.
Put us in the order. She's already got
That's
our.
right.
Yeah, so what,
You guys,
standing?
we'll memorize, yes.
Standing,
You
sitting.
want us to stand?
Stand
Stand up.
Or-
Push in, all together.
Push in. Yeah, perfect.
All in together.
All together.
Close,
Or in.
happy.
Close one more.
Thank you. Thank you. You guys are
Yay.
great. I appreciate it. All right.
Thanks, sir.